Hi, this is Chris Errington, Argyle reporter for Plymouth Live and the Herald, and you're listening to the Green and White podcast.
So here we go then. We promised you this would be an exciting and revealing My Argyle Life, and me and Sam are delighted to welcome Plymouth Live's own and reporter of nearly 30 years of Plymouth Argyle history, Chris Errington, to the podcast. Chris, you've contributed in many forms before on our emergency podcasts and things before, but this is your show. I feel like Michael Aspel, this is your life. Chris Errington, good evening.
Good evening, Joe. Good evening, Sam. No pressure at all there then, is there?
Absolutely.
Nearly 30 years. It's almost, I'm almost like, I feel like a sort of walking encyclopedia on Plymouth Argyle. And when I was growing up in Kent all those years ago, I would never have thought that I would end up being reasonably knowledgeable on the most southwesterly club in the Football League. But that's where life takes you sometimes, and it's been a hell of a ride.
Well, absolutely, and this is where you show your media training. And you haven't seen my running order, but we're going to seamlessly segue into what you said about all those years back in Kent, and we're going to go right the way back to the early days. Why journalism? Why sports journalism in particular? Where did that all come from?
I think, like a lot of journalists, football journalists, you grow up dreaming of being a professional footballer, and at some stage in your youth, and mine was pretty early on, to be fair, you realise that professional football is probably not going to be for you. And there was a teacher at my primary school called Mrs. Tomlin, and she used to sort of say on a Monday morning in the classroom, write something about what you did at the weekend. And my dad always used to take me to see the local non-league football team in Kent, which was Ramsgate. And we used to go and see them every Saturday. And then on the Monday morning, I would write basically a very mini 7-year-old match report on what I'd seen with Ramsgate. And Mrs. Tomlin came up with a great idea of saying, well, you should be a football reporter when you grow up, Chris. And that always was in the back of my mind. And yeah, very fortunately, I've been able to sort of follow that career path. And, it's led me to covering a unique football club in so many ways. As Plymouth Argyle won trophies and leagues and things, not so much. But, I don't need to tell all your viewers and listeners that Argyle's a special club. It's got a place in the community, a place in the Southwest. And there's very few people, I think, come across Argyle in whatever capacity it might be. And when they leave, they don't think well of it. Not everyone, but I think more than a lot of football clubs, you talk to anyone and they say, yeah, I was at Argyle, I loved it there.
Absolutely. And obviously you had that early interest in journalism. And I presume that just grew as you got older and, the knowledge of football, if you like, got better. Where did that take you then from those early years? I presume obviously university course must have been a sports journalism kind of thing, was it? And then what was your earliest avenue into actually write? Did you ever get into writing for a specific club, particularly in local press, or for them before it developed from there?
I did a year's course in Portsmouth. Our family moved to the Isle of Wight. I did a year's course in Portsmouth. And during that time, I met the guy that used to cover Portsmouth FC, a guy called Mike Newsom. He was one of the typical sort of football journalists of the time who covered the club home and away, was ultra professional, was very considerate when I spent a little bit of time around him. I did a match report for a game at Fratton Park one night, and he looked through it and gave me the tips and advice, like, a lot of young reporters start off with. So, I was grateful to meet somebody like Mike, who was ultra professional in what he did. And then I started on the Isle of Wight County Press, my local paper. And like a lot of reporters did at the time, and Joe, I'm making myself sound old here, but I started on the Isle of Wight County Press in 1986. But at the time, you would do, and bearing in mind it was on the Isle of Wight, you do carnivals, flower shows, you go to the magistrates court and see which people hadn't paid their TV licenses, you do golden wedding anniversaries, you name it. I covered it on the Isle of Wight. But, and people do say this, and it's true, it was a good training ground. You meet people, you get used to meeting people in slightly different surroundings than you're used to. You get used to asking questions. You find out which questions work, the way to ask questions. And at the time, you probably don't appreciate it. But when you look back and you think, well, crikey, if I can go to a flower show in Knighton and I know nothing about flowers whatsoever, but I can still write a report about the event and it not look completely hopeless, then you've sort of learnt a skill. And so Isle of Wight County Press was where I learned it all, a couple of years there. But of course, I always wanted to be a football reporter. I went back to Kent. I got a job on the Kent Messenger Group, which was a good sort of local evening and weekly newspaper group, and then spent a few years there. I was the number 2 there for quite a bit of the time, to a guy called Tony Hudd, who covered Gillingham for donkey's years and years. Tony was absolutely brilliant. I've been fortunate to meet sort of football journalists whose jobs were what I've ended up doing, and they were so generous and supportive. And I sort of was the number 2 to Tony. So if Tony was off for whatever reason, I'd cover Gillingham. I might go to the odd game. I might do the odd press conference. But that sort of dipped my toe into it. That was a good experience. I'm thinking back to Gillingham, and they had people like Glenn Roeder as their manager, Mike Flanagan, the old Cheltenham Palace striker, people like that. And you got to, Glenn Roeder, you got to meet people like that and sort of whetted the appetite. And then the chance came to join the Herald in Plymouth. It was the Evening Herald then. It was an evening paper, no such thing as internet back in those days, in 95. And as a sports reporter again. And I suppose as time went on, I sort of stood in for Graham Hamley. And again, you know, as I've mentioned, Mike Neeson and Tony Hudd. Graham, you know, an icon of Plymouth journalism, covered the club for the best part of 30 years. But if he wasn't at a game or, you know, there was interviews to be done, I'd step in. And then after a couple of years, Graham sort of stepped aside and did a few different things, although he ended up covering Argyle for the Sunday Independent for a couple of seasons, and we'd go to quite a few away games together. But yeah, 97 was when I started covering Argyle, and yeah, no one would have thought that, I don't think that all this time later I'd still be covering Argyle, although it's a completely different job in so many ways to when I started. It's I'm still covering Argyle, but the way I do it is, completely different.
Yeah, and it's your show, not ours. It's a really, really insightful answer. We will obviously come on maybe a bit later into your, long tenure with Argyle and how journalism has changed in that time. But just a little bit more on your early life then. You mentioned about how you got into it because of your love of football and wanting to be a footballer. Interested, it was football that led you into journalism rather than journalism that led you into football journalism, as it were. So did it never interest you when you were doing your stuff in the Isle of Wight and in Kent to go into any other like investigative journalism, political, anything like that kind, or was that never really on the cards for you?
No, Sam, I was
football all the way.
Football all the way, and that's my dad's fault because he ingrained football into me, like a lot of parents do, isn't it? A lot of football fans. Why do you support that team, or why are you into football? It's your parents, and he would take me every Saturday, and it was just became the norm. And all these years later, Saturday is football. The days, the last couple of seasons when we've had international breaks and you haven't got a game on a Saturday, and well, what are we going to do on Saturday? What do we do? And you might go out into town or something like that, and you think, so this is what people do if they're not football fans. Sort of very, very strange world. But no, I always wanted to be a football reporter. I mean, that's where I was lucky that I had a teacher who sort of almost pointed me in the direction from a young age. And I remember talking to a careers teacher when I was a bit older, Mr. Hankinson, and we had one of those conversations. What do you want to do when you grow up? And I said I wanted to be a football reporter, and he said, well, you're never going to be a millionaire doing that. And he was correct on that score as well. So, but I had good advice. I had people pointing me in the right way. And I think I was lucky because lots of people grow up. My two oldest stepsons are a bit like this. You know, they grew up and they weren't really sure what they wanted to do. And they found their way. But, you know, it's not always easy for people to find their career path, is it? And I was fortunate that really I knew what I wanted to do. I was focused on doing it. I knew what exams I needed to do. I knew where I needed to go. And so it always felt, well, certainly looking back now, but even at the time, I think it felt like this is the road I'm going on, and it's just getting from A to B, getting there.
Absolutely. I mean, I must admit, I'm 32 and I'm still not entirely sure on mine, so I don't blame you. I haven't been in the same boat, but it's great that you had that focus and determination for that. And obviously, Palace were your first love in footballing terms, weren't they? Do you still ever go to games? Do you see much of Palace these days?
Well, I was fortunate enough to get a ticket for the FA Cup final in May. So, the last sort of competitive game of football I watched was probably the best of my life, I think. So thanks for asking that one, Sam.
At the time of recording, we obviously don't know what the outcome of the appeal will be, whether they'll be in the Europa League or the Conference League. But either way, they're going to be in Europe. Do you plan to go and see?
I was just going to say, Chris, is the passport in order? Are you ready to tour Europe?
I think it's unlikely, but I'd hope to watch them in whatever competition they're in. I mean, there is a funny story about Palace and Argyle, Joe and Sam, because the really weird thing about things is that my first ever game watching Palace at Selhurst Park was in November 1974, and it was Crystal Palace 3, Argyle 3. So the first game I ever watched just over 50 years ago. And it is, you know, I've been to Selhurst Park, goodness knows how many times since then. But I do find it slightly weird that the first team I saw Palace ever play at Selhurst Park was the team that I've ended up watching for 28 years sort of thing. So got good memories of that one. Mariner and Rafferty scored for Argyle. I don't really remember that. They played in green and white stripes and white shorts. I wasn't really too bothered at the time. Palace were managed by Malcolm Allison at the time. They wore the red and blue stripes. They'd just become the Eagles. It was the season before they got to the FA Cup semi-final. It was all exciting. And, you know, I suppose once you see, or most people, I think, you go to a game and you get the bug bites you, doesn't it? In that you get hooked. And so that Palace Argyle game, definitely was one that sticks in the memory. And so enjoyed the highs and lows of Palace, and in some ways Argyle are similar in the fact that it's very rarely dull watching both football teams.
Yeah, weirdly seem to have shared a lot of managers over the years as well, haven't they? Like you said, Malcolm Allison, Ian Holloway, Tony Pulis, Neil Warnock. It must have been awesome to go from your sort of reporter hat to your fan hat with those managers, I guess. But anyway, we're here to talk about Argyle primarily.
Yes, please do.
Yeah, you joined obviously the Herald, reporting on the club in the kind of mid-late 90s. That was right at the peak of when relations between the club and the Herald were at their worst, wasn't it? With Dan McCauley, he actually banned the Herald from the ground at the point. What was that like? Were you one of the people who was watching the game from the top of a cherry picker?
I was indeed, Sam. Yeah, I went to great heights to watch Argyle that season. It was actually my first season reporting on Argyle full time. So it was early in the 97-98 season. And yes, it was a difficult time for the club. Dan McCauley was in charge, and I think he'd been a little bit stung by the Peter Shilton time at Argyle, and quite a bit of money had been spent, and it hadn't worked out for whatever reason. That was before my time, but I think Dan was not quite so keen to spend as much money on Argyle as he had in the past. One of the early games I saw after I joined the Herald was the Wembley Player Final against Darlington. I wasn't working that day, but I went up and watched it and saw, 35,000 probably Argyle fans that day, something like that. And you got a taste of what Argyle was like. yeah, I took over from Graham for the 97-98 season, and yeah, there was a lot going on. There was a lot of fan unrest, unhappiness, petitions, red card protests, fans showing up red cards in the games and things like that. And Dan didn't appreciate the tone of the media coverage from the Herald, the Western Morning News. I just don't think he was particularly happy with the criticism that was coming his way. And it did lead to the Herald and the Morning News, sister papers, both getting banned from Home Park. And so as you rightly say, we ended up with a cherry picker parked in the lower part of the Devonport End car park. So where the lower part of the car park is now, obviously that was before the Horseshoe was there, and it was the old Devonport End. So people remember it was an open terrace, and if you went 60 foot up in the air in a cherry picker, you had a great view of the inside of the Home Park, and you could see the game. And I think if you see any photos of Home Park looking like that from the aerial one, a guy called Wayne Perry, who was a photographer of the Herald, came up with me. And so we both went up in the cherry picker, and Wayne had the camera and got some really quite good aerial photos. Now, obviously, with drones these days, it's so simple to do. But at the time, it was quite unusual to see, a picture of Home Park like that. And I think the first game we did was against Brentford in September 97. And I think the crowd was only about 4,500, 5,000. The crowds had dipped. Some of the stands weren't always open because of safety issues. So if you ever see a photo like that, the ground looks pretty empty. They played Brentford. Remember it very well. Got to the ground. Cherry picker was waiting there. The guy was there saying, would you like to wear a harness? And you're just about to go 60 foot up in the air. Of course I want to wear a harness. Have you seen where I'm going? I'm going up there. And watch the game. Always, when I was in the press box at the time, you'd have the notepad and pen. Wasn't too keen on being up in the cherry picker and writing in my notepad with the pen while I was up there. Wanted to make sure I got a firm grip on the rail at the top of the cherry picker. So I had my dictaphone and sort of had my dictaphone running. And so instead of writing notes down, it was 3 minutes. Ronnie Mojay crosses for Martin Barlow, shoots wide. And so I had my notes on sort of audio form, watched the game, came back down and ended up doing a report from that. So I think we did about 4 or 5 games like that. And then it got to the stage where it was getting a bit cold, a bit chilly. And, when you're 60 foot up in the air, it's a hell of a lot colder than when you're down at the ground level. And so that wasn't so keen on that. But fortunately, long story short, Dan, I think it was getting towards Christmas time, and Dan said, "Oh, come on, it's Christmas, come back and carry on," sort of thing. So we resumed coverage, and Dan was a character. He was quite unpredictable, but his heart was in the right place. He just didn't like the criticism that came with the job of being the Argyle owner and chairman at a time where the crowds were pretty low. The club was at quite a low ebb. A very different club to the one now. I know we're just coming off a relegation now, but the club is just so much better set up, structured, infrastructure, everything. It's amazing the difference. But very early on in my first season, watching games from a cherry picker, that wasn't quite how I envisaged it. But anyway, it's a story to tell.
Yeah, we will move on to happier times in a minute, but one last question on the kind of McCauley era, and then before we move on to the upturn that happened after that. Did you find that tough when he did let you back in the respect of, obviously, you wanted to be as honest and objective as you can, but at the same time, you were probably thinking, hang on a minute, I don't want to end up back on that cherry picker again. How tough was that to find the right tone? Yeah,
it is. And it's one of the things about doing this job, Sam, I think, and you could ask any sort of football reporter who covers a club specifically. It is trying to find the balance between constructive criticism, but also giving the club the opportunity to put their say on things. And back in those days, of course, there was no such thing as Argyle having their own staff to provide stories, interviews. The only way Argyle could get publicity out was through a magazine that they occasionally did. I think they called it The Pilgrim. It was launched 2 or 3 different times. They'd have that, they'd have the programme, and that was about it. So as much as Dan probably didn't really want to admit it, the coverage at the Herald, the morning news, and the local TV and radio at the time, because I think everyone had their own issues at one stage or another, was really important, because there wasn't any real other opportunity for Argyle to get their message, their publicity, their promotion. Come and see us. This is why you should come and see us. If it wasn't through the local papers, so it always was and still is striking that balance between, if you've got some people who are saying you're too critical and not positive enough, and if you get some people saying the vice versa, if you've got people saying that, you're probably doing a pretty good job of sort of negotiating your way through, so that you're doing your job, you're criticising where you need to constructively, but praising where praise is due.
Yeah, as a I wouldn't dream calling ourselves a media outlet as such, but as a independent fan site who tries to do such similar stuff, I feel the pain and I know that dilemma. Obviously, it became far easier to be positive in the years that followed, didn't it? Paul Sturrock came in, took the club from the mid-table of the 4th tier, and obviously left just before getting promoted back up to the 2nd tier. But it was an incredible few years. What were those years like? Those glory years, the Rochdale, the Darlington promotion and title games like that. How good a feeling was that to be covering the club in that time?
It was great, because as we know, in more recent times, when Argyle have success, the whole of the community, the whole of Plymouth come together, and there is nothing like it. I can remember the trophy parades after the 2 league title successes, and everyone stood below the council house in Plymouth. It was similar, wasn't it, in 2016-17 when they were runners up in League Two, and we had the same sort of thing. And a couple of years ago when they won League One, and we even had a boat trip, didn't we, from the players coming round to the Barbican and landing there. So Paul Sturrock, the younger listeners, viewers will have heard of him. But boy, when he came into the football club in October 2000, he gave the club the real shot in the arm it needed. It was incredible. A little bit like Ryan Lowe coming in 2019 for more recent Argyle fans, where Ryan came in, and at the start of that season, you almost forgot we'd been relegated the pre-season, having lost 5-1 at Errington on the penultimate day of the season, because he was just so positive. And Luggy came in, Paul Sturrock came in, and he came in the October. The club was sort of a mid-table 4th division side. It was really going nowhere. And he took 6 months to work out what players he had, how the club worked. And then he started taking over. And the two league titles in 3 seasons. Technically, they didn't win the league when Paul was still the manager, when they beat QPR in Bobby Williamson's first game as manager. But that was effectively Paul's league title, really. He's created it also. So 2 league titles in 3 seasons. Such an amazing character to get to know. We would sit and do press conferences. If you can remember the old entrance to Home Park, there was the big green gate, and just to the right of that was a very small ticket office, and then a little office in behind there where the Argyle staff would work now, and the manager's office. Wasn't a very big space at all, which shows you how few staff Argyle were probably operating with at the time. But there was a little office there, and we'd go up there on a Thursday, and we'd meet Paul in the little sort of reception area. He'd often go into the ticket office and make us a cup of tea, and we'd sit there for ages just chewing the fat about all sorts of things. if a fan came in because they had an inquiry about whatever, they wanted to speak to somebody, they'd be very surprised to see Paul sat there on a Thursday chatting away. He was brilliant with the fans. He would talk to anyone who came in. They were obviously delighted to see the Argyle manager sat there having a chat with them. And we used to have some great fun, great times. He had great success. He won Manager of the Month several times. Back in those days, nationwide, the Building Society were the league sponsors, and they used to do some lovely Manager of the Month luncheons where they'd invite the local media to turn up, and we'd go along and we'd have some free food and drink. It was very nice. Luggy would just sit there at the top of the table and just regale everyone with his stories, because I'm not sure how much people appreciate, but he was an absolute top player in Scottish football. He played all of his career at Dundee United. You talk to anyone from Scotland and they would tell you that if Kenny Dalglish hadn't been Scottish, Paul Sturrock would have probably played 100 times for Scotland. But he played the same position as Kenny Dalglish. So Kenny Dalglish played all the games, and Luggy got, I think it was 20 odd appearances. I could be wrong. It wasn't masses. It was still a lot, but it wasn't masses. He went to World Cups and things, but he was a top player. So people used to love seeing him when he was down at Argyle. He had, a real positive way about him. The signings he made, the characters he brought in, the mentality of the squad. He brought some real characters, strong. Graham Cochran is a great example of it. He brought some really good quality character people that bought into exactly what Luggy wanted. And I don't think you can ever underestimate. You winning 2 titles in 3 seasons is not easy at all. And he did a brilliant job. He was a great character. Obviously came back for the second spell. It was a different club, different times, more difficult challenge for him then. And it obviously didn't work out as anyone would have wanted. But yeah, if you said to me, what are some of your favourite memories? Definitely 01 to 04 with Paul Sturrock in charge. He was absolutely brilliant for the football club.
Yeah, and it was around that time, I believe, Chris, wasn't it? And I'll hand back to Joe for this little segment, because I know we've got a few questions to ask. That you first got the opportunity to obviously sit in the commentary box as well with a man who we all hold dear to our heart. He's no longer with us. Gordon Sparks, of course, the late great Gordon Sparks. And I think, Joe, you had a few questions about that, didn't you?
Yeah, just on Luggy, Chris, I think, in recent times, obviously, we talk about Simon Hallett and how immeasurably he's changed the DNA of the football club, if you like. And, even what we're saying there, even 10 years ago, this is a completely different football club. It's on a totally different level to what we're at. I think it's only now really that people appreciate just where Paul Sturrock sits in that pantheon as well, of how he changed the DNA of Plymouth Argyle Football Club, didn't he? Because he took us, as Sam says, from the moment he came in, he just took us from not rock bottom, but he took us to levels that were scarcely believable in such a short space of time and with such a togetherness. I
think his first game, Joe, I could be wrong. I think I'm right. His first game was against Chester in an FA at home park. Was against Chester in an FA Cup tie, and Chester were non-league at the time. Argyle were in the 4th division. Chester beat Argyle, and so his first game at home park, Argyle were getting beaten at home by non-league teams when they were mid-table in the 4th division, and then within a relatively short space of time, there we were playing against QPR in front of 20,000 people at home park, beating them 2-0. Sparksy's immortal line, 2-0, that's it, Argyle are up. That wasn't that long a period. That was sort of November 2000 to April 2003. And in that time, you look at all the images of that day against QPR, don't you? And the size of the crowd, the ground itself had changed completely. Everything about the club changed. And without Paul Sturrock, I don't think that would have happened. Dan McCauley mentioned it a few times, that they were very close to appointing a guy called Ian Atkins, who was, a journeyman football manager. and he was a perfectly decent journeyman football manager. But if they'd gone with him, I just cannot see he would have had the personality and what have you to drag Argyle out of the doldrums. But Luggy just came in with his his Scottish humour, his impishness, his ability to spot a player, to get players to play the way he wanted. They were so well drilled, that team. You know, home they would play 4-4-2, away they would play 4-5-1. They all knew their jobs. You speak to any of the Argyle players of that era, and they will tell you the same. They were just so well drilled. And I agree, Joe. You know, as time goes by, you look back on things, and I know Argyle have been up and down, up and down, up and down. But look at Home Park and how it changed under Paul, how it changed as a stadium under Paul Sturrock. Look at the team. Look at the fan base they built up. They went from 4,500, 5,000 people to 16,000 people in the first season in the Championship. Now the crowds did dip a little bit after that, but you've got to build your fan base. You have to build the fan base. And Luggy, the style of football, the players that played for him, you know, Frio, Lario, Norris, all those sort of players, you know, fantastic players. It was brilliant. So no, I agree. He isn't there a thing at the moment about Mount Rushmore and things like that? And who would your 4 clubs people be? Luggy would have to be one of them. Absolutely.
And I feel incredibly lucky that I'm in that generation where my first game would have been, I think it was the spring of 2001. So it would have been early in Luggy's tenure. The ship was turning round by that point. And to be a youngster who didn't really, by all accounts, from what I'm told, because I was quite young at the time, I didn't have a huge interest in sport. But from the moment I went to that first game and got hooked on it, you know, I've never looked back. And without that period, we all say it, you know, glory supporters and things, but without that good run, without that good feeling period around the club, I don't think my interest would have stood the length of time. So I've certainly got a lot to thank Luggy for. But as Sam said, during that period, it brought you your opportunity to work with a great friend of yours, I'm sure, as it developed through the time, but also a great friend to the city of Plymouth and the region in the late great Sir Gordon Sparks. And what fun you guys had. I mean, that's what it came across to me, because my Saturday afternoons when Argyle were away would more than likely consist of Radio Devon from 2:00, the build-up, the match, the funny halftime stories about going to get a cup of tea or what food was on offer. And the one that always sticks out in my head was the lovely old ladies who used to sit in front of you at Errington and turning around and offering you their cake and their sweets and what have you during the game. I mean, just recount a couple of stories, if you've got them, of just how much fun it was working alongside, you know, such a great man.
Yeah, an absolute legend. I do think, on a serious note, Joe, that as much as Luggy was revitalised the club during that period, 2000 to 2004, I think Sparksy did as well. He played a big part in it. Now, I think it helped that the team started picking up at the same time. But again, back in the days before live streaming and social media and stuff like that, if you were an Argyle fan and they were away from home, the only really way you could follow it was through Sparksy's commentaries. And again, like Luggy, such a personality, such a brilliant broadcaster. He could paint pictures, and I could never quite understand how he would sit commentating on a game with his headphones on, and he's describing everything in minute detail, because he would always say you've got to paint a picture as a radio commentator. TV commentators, you don't have to necessarily speak that much. Radio commentators, you have to paint a picture. And he'd have his headphones on, and all the time the producer back in the studio would be giving him score updates. He'd be telling him, you've got to go over to Torquay now, or you've got to go over here now. And he's got all this noise and chat going on, and he's still focused completely on the game, describing the action. He had a hardback book, which he would write all the details for each game. So he'd have the lineups. He always did it in pencil. So he'd do it before the game, and then when the team news come out and there might have been 1 or 2 changes, he'd have one of those pencils with a rubber on the end, just rub out the name of the player that wasn't in the team, change that. Immaculate handwriting, just the attention to detail. And people loved listening to Sparksy. He was, and I've said this a few times, people said, oh, wasn't he a bit biased? He wasn't biased. He was partisan. And that was what Sparksy would always say. There's a difference between biased, which is saying stuff which obviously isn't true, but you're just saying it because it's your team, and partisan in a way where, yes, you want Argyle to do well. He was commentating Radio Devon on Argyle, so of course he was going to favour Argyle, but when things were going well, we had some great moments of commentary that people, I'm sure, will have some favourite memories of. But when Argyle weren't doing very well, he wasn't afraid to be critical as well and have his say that things weren't as good as they should be. So he was brilliant to work with. We both like cricket, and we, in a very poor man's way, tried to sort of do the test match special where, if there was a bus, if we were sat at Hartlepool United and we could look out over the press box and you could see across to the Asda and the Met roundabout over there, if you saw a bus going past and, the game wasn't that exciting, it was 0-0, it was a Division 4 game, and, the pitch was covered in mud and it was howling a gale off the North Sea. And if you saw a bus going past and there was a bit of a dull patch, and Sparksy would say, well, look, there's the old number 87 going off to South Shields or something like that. And I think it just sort of, we tried to have fun. I mean, it was absolute privilege to sit with him in the press box. Lots of memories. Like you say, Joe, at Accrington, we always used to get treated extremely well. I think they were called Uncle Joe mint balls. Anyone from Lancashire might know what I mean. I think it was sort of a Wigan type thing, but the lady who would sit in front of us was obviously a season ticket holder. She'd always turn around and give you the Uncle Joe's mint balls. And I did see recently a lady, and it was quite funny because I do remember a game, and I mentioned Hartlepool a minute ago, where we sat in the press box at Hartlepool and we ended up getting a chocolate cake delivered to us in the press box, which we ate during the game. I mean, it was full test match special then, because any cricket fans of a certain time will know that they used, when, Henry Blofeld and people like that were commentating on the cricket, that most of the time it seemed like they were eating cake that was sent in to them by listeners. And so there's me and Sparksy sat eating chocolate cake while we were watching Hartlepool and Argyle. And not so long ago, I was talking to a lady, and she said, do you remember a time when you had chocolate cake at Hartlepool? And I said, yeah, it was lovely. She said, oh, well, I was the one that made it. So all these years later, I had a chance to thank her for some excellent chocolate cake. But we love going to games. We had the same sort of sense of humour. Both liked the NFL. Sparksy had some hilarious times with him and Carlton Palmer. Sort of had a bit of a sort of a little bit of a sort of funny relationship when Argyle were playing Stockport quite a bit one season. I remember him breaking the press box bench at Southampton and having to commentate with everything on his lap because the bench itself had fallen. There was a game at Notts County at Meadow Lane where we were quite high up in the main stand at Meadow Lane, and he wasn't happy with match officials, hence the partisan bit. And he sort of threw over to me and said, Chris, what did you think? And he put his lip mic down, moved across to the side and shouted, linesman, have a word with yourself. And he shouted it at top of his voice. I'm not sure whether the linesman would have heard him, but brilliant guy. And the mural in Central Park now, I hope everyone's seen it, or if you haven't, go and have a look at it, because that mural captures the essence of him on the side of the house. It's a great image of him. It looks exactly like Sparksy. It's how I remember him. There's even like a chain around his neck that I can vividly remember him wearing. He'd wear an open neck polo shirt, BBC Radio Devon one, and he'd have this neck chain around, and it's just the attention to detail on that mural. And the first time I saw it, I must admit, I know I'm not the only one. The first time I saw that mural, I did have a bit of a tear in my eye because it was so lifelike, so realistic. A brilliant tribute to a brilliant man.
Yeah, and as you say, very quickly, Sam, as you say, you talk about the Mount Rushmore of Argyle heroes and greats and what have you. I think you touched on it at the start of what you said, that period, it was almost like Luggy's steering us away and Sparksy's rise to cult status, if you like, went hand in hand. And
absolutely, yeah. And it got the fan base infused. It got people. Yeah. I would, on a Sunday morning, or Sunday, I'd go out somewhere, and everyone would say, "Oh, yeah, I heard you and Sparksy," and it was their listener figures at the time must have been amazing. It felt like everyone in Plymouth was listening to it on a Saturday afternoon, and I do think, Sparksy was a driver in getting people enthused, excited, following the football club. And yeah, we were Morecambe and Wise. He did all the jokes. I was the sort of straight man and tried to sort of make a few valid points along the way. And one favourite memory just is when we went to Morecambe a few seasons ago, and we got to stand side by side with the Eric Morecambe statue on the seafront. Everyone's had their picture taken by the Eric Morecambe statue, I think. But Sparksy and I were sort of either side of it, and that felt quite good because, people sometimes said, I was a bit like listening to Morecambe and Wise, you two sometimes, and there we were, sort of thing. So that's a good memory of working with Sparksy. Yeah,
absolutely. And I hope that, in those final years, he was comforted to know just how many people will never be able to express into words how much, not just from an Argyle point of view, but also his breakfast show that became iconic in this region, just how much he meant to a lot of people. And, I'll never forget that day at, was it MK Dons?
MK Dons, I was just about to say, yeah.
The sad news came out, the fans singing his name, and then, he'll forever be remembered and never forgotten at Home Park, and his legacy will live on forever. And it's important, I think, as fans and yourself in the media group, if you like, and as people of Plymouth, that we never let Sparksy's legacy die, because it's just a wonderful, wonderful man and a huge advocate for Plymouth Argyle.
I mean, look at the fact, Joe, that basically the funeral service was held in the Devonport end at Home Park. And there was the Devonport end was full. I mean, there was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people there. That doesn't happen for. Well, it's the first time I've ever heard of it. I mean, I think it's unique. I can't, think of anyone media-wise that's, when they've passed, they've had the outpouring of, affection, sadness, but affection. And you say you hope he realised. The love that the Green Army had for him, and I think he did. You mentioned that Milton Keynes Dons game, Joe, and it was the day before he passed away, and he was listening to the match commentary on Radio Devon. He was at St Luke's Hospice, and he heard the fans singing, "One Gordon Sparks, there's only one Gordon Sparks." I mean, that I think that was really nice, and I know Heather and the family really appreciated that the fans were thinking of him that way in a very sad, difficult time. But it's surely given them lots of good memories about how much the Green Army appreciated Sparksy. And I agree, Joe. I think I enjoy sitting in the Gordon Sparks press box at Home Park every other Saturday. There's a little sign on the entrance, and so every Saturday, every game we're there. We're in the Gordon Sparks press box, so I think that's a nice tribute.
Yeah, and I think that was his final ever visit to Home Park, or certainly one of his final visits when they officially named it as that. And I think that was a fitting sort of tribute to him. I thought, a lot of suggestions after he passed, people saying that they should have named a stand after him or something. But I think that what he was in the press box, that's what he loved doing.
He would have hated that, Sam. He would have hated that.
Yeah.
That would have been too much.
I think that would have been naming the press box after him was just the absolute perfect option. And if I may, I don't know, we're running a little over time on this section. Just my very brief personal indulgence, and I know that Joe did one as well. I'm also very much of the case that Sparksy influenced my support as an Argyle fan hugely. When I first started going, again, very similar to Joe, actually. Me and Joe have never actually spoken about how similar our Argyle upbringings did. Well, I'd also had no interest in football up to the age of about 8, which, if anyone who knows me now might find remarkable. But when I first my dad, sort of to help me understand what was going on, gave me one of those I'll show my age here, little portable radios you can carry around with you. So obviously,
Sam, you don't have to worry about showing your age. I was telling you about my first game in 1997. So you're a youngster.
I did reveal my age a few minutes earlier anyway, but I had the little portable radio, and I know that you yourself didn't do the home games so much, but it was him and a few others, and certainly for the away games, the ones I didn't go to, listening to, your good self and Sir Gordon, the kind of chemistry, the banter between the two of you, like you said, the test match special kind of adjacent stuff was, I think, really drew you in, and I think really was the perfect complement to what was a very good time for the club. But we are obviously talking about your Argyle life, as your title goes, and it wouldn't really be a full picture if we didn't talk about a very bad time for the club, the administration years. What on earth was that like following? Because obviously, as much as it would have been, you care about Argyle deeply and seeing what's happening, I guess, you must have, in the back of your mind, must have been, hang on a minute, if Argyle go bust, is my own job at risk? What was that whole time like for you?
Yeah, I mean, there were lots of stories, but not many of them were any good. And yeah, it was a challenge to try to be professional, to get as much information, accurate information out there as possible. That was not easy at the time, particularly when you had an administrator in charge, and the release of information for some good reasons at times was pretty limited. And I just felt sorry for the people that you dealt with. Peter Reid, again, if we're going to talk about people who, have played a really important part in Argyle's history, certainly in my time watching Argyle, you look at what that guy did and went through in the administration. And it was fascinating to get to meet him and to get to know him. Because again, another hugely successful football player and manager. And he ended up at Argyle in 2010. And, he soon found himself embroiled in this horrendous situation where Argyle were plummeting into financial oblivion. And he had to try and hold things together. And as much as Luggy was the positive, galvanizing force, Peter Reid had to be the steady the ship, I don't think is quite the right phrase, but just try to stop the club from completely disintegrating. You look at, I've looked at like Sheffield Wednesday recently, and there's players leaving because they haven't been paid, and Windass and Smith and people like that. And that was the same thing that Argyle were going through. Players could serve their notice and move on. Kari Arnason, the Icelandic international, was one of those. And, players weren't getting paid, staff weren't getting paid, people behind the staff, that it was their club, and the club had just fallen apart. And again, a little sort of comparison, Argyle were relegated out of the Championship and were in a complete and utter mess then. You fast forward to now, we've been relegated from the Championship. Yes, things are not as good as people would like, but the club is so much better set up now and positioned to be able to cope with a relegation from the Championship than they were before they went into administration, because once they got relegated then, they just could not afford to pay their bills. And it was really sad to see a club that, I mean, let's face it, when they went into administration, it was only, 6-7 years after the glory days of Paul Sturrock, and everyone loved Plymouth, everyone loved Argyle, everyone loved everything about the club. And yet, in a relatively short space of time, you're reporting on a team that are, not paying their bills, not paying their players, going to games. There was one game against Oxford United where I think it was a midweek game and we might have lost 5-0, 5-1. And it was basically just the kids. It was just the kids. Young players that come through the ranks, that tried their best, and in a different circumstance might have had better careers at the clubs, but they were just thrown in at the deep end. Matt LeCointe, Jared Sims, people like that, names people might remember. They were just thrown in and had to play these games, and they stood no chance really. And obviously James Brent came in and took the club over, but there were some bumpy times before that happened. There was a game at Burton Albion. I remember Peter Reid and Carl doing a press conference where the Carl and Roman Laria, I think as well, were basically saying on behalf of the players that, if we don't start getting paid, we're not playing. And there was a sort of a threat that, of going on strike. And, that's how bad it got, that you were sat doing a press conference with those three people at Margin University, I remember, and, basically them saying, we could go on strike. We might not play this game against Burton Albion. And so, again, it's that highs and lows of reporting on a football club. It's just, how can you go from such a great day as QPR to 5 or 6 years later, the players are almost refusing to play because they're not getting paid?
Yeah, there's a saying in sport. You mentioned cricket. I'll briefly mention Formula One. And after Sebastian Vettel won his 4th world title in a row, he said, enjoy the good times because they don't last forever and they end a lot quicker than you think.
Yeah.
In my 20-odd years supporting Argyle, and you're even longer covering Argyle, that saying has certainly proven to be enormously true. I mean, it must have just been a bit of a dynamite moment, though, from a reporting point of view, that you're there with the captain and the vice captain, and hang on a minute, they're threatening to go on strike. It must have been, blimey, this is the kind of story that you never dreamed of getting. And Joe has a couple of other sort of wow moments that we want to sort of briefly cover before we maybe go on to the more recent years. So, Joe, I'll hand back to you briefly.
Yeah, I mean, it's safe to say, Chris, in that period, if we go from 2011 to, I don't know, roughly around 2016, from purely press conference moments, there were some big ones. And the first one I wanted to touch on was on a sad and an emotional one, was New Year's Day 2012, was it?
Yeah.
Where a man... Sorry, Sam, I knew you'd correct me on it. 2013, where a man who, I think it's safe to say, had given literally everything for Argyle over 5 and a bit years, in Carl Fletcher, was relieved of his duties after let's be honest, a pretty timid effort at the Memorial Stadium. Just how difficult a press conference was that? Because I remember watching it on the coach back. Yeah. When the video was put out, and it touched my heartstrings seeing Fletch as emotional as he was, because you could see he'd put everything into this club, for this football club.
I always liked and got on well with Carl Fletcher, but my respect for him went up to, the highest level you could possibly have that day, Joe, because he came into the press conference room at the Memorial Stadium. Sparksy was doing the interview, and so for Radio Devon, he would go first. And I can't remember the exact, but it felt like for a reasonable amount of time, Sparksy was asking him questions about the game. And there was no sort of suggestion anything had gone on before Carl had come in to see us. And then about halfway through Sparksy's interview, Carl just threw out into the conversation something along the lines, it won't be me. I've just been sacked. And you've got a room full of journalists who were like, what did he just say? And it'd just been sacked. And he had come in, having lost his job just a few minutes earlier, and had a perfectly normal post-match press conference interview with people before introducing it into the press conference himself. There's very, very few people that would have fronted up like that in those circumstances. Very few people. The emotions must have been raw. Carl, put so much into the club during that administration period. A favourite memory in a difficult time was Fletcher's very late equaliser at Shrewsbury on the opening day of the 11-12 season, where the club was, hanging on by its fingertips. And
that was the no kit, the 7 contracted players like the night or the week before and everything, wasn't it? And
1-0 down in about the 90 whatever minute, playing towards the away end, which was full as nearly always, and he scored the equaliser. And I mean, that couldn't have been more fitting. If anyone was going to come up and score an equaliser that day, it was him. And bear in mind, he came to Argyle as a player, as a former Premier League player who would have certainly have been wanting to continue his career in the Championship at the very least. And yet there he ended up finding himself the manager of a team in administration in League Two in a very short space of time. And the other thing I'd say about Carl, Joe, is that I think he could have played on for another 2-3 years, but I think he effectively sacrificed his playing career to become the manager of Argyle, when probably not that many people would have been really keen to take over the job. And so I do feel that he gave up his playing career a little bit early to help out Argyle. So again, we're touching on these people during our conversation, aren't we, that have played important parts in the club's survival. And Carl Fletcher is definitely another very good candidate for that sort of little list that we are compiling as we go along.
It's a shame, really. You could obviously, I'm conscious of the fact that on this Monday evening, you probably want to get on with your evening if you have more time. I'd love to kind of go through every single head coach you've worked with in detail. Maybe that might be one for another pod if you'd be so kind.
Absolutely, and I'm always happy to join you.
Yeah, but I suppose now look with those, one who was perhaps very sort of fiery in some of his press conference answers was Derek Adams, and had a bit of a knack for getting into feuds with other managers. What was he like to deal with?
Derek was very good. The last few months, it became a little bit more difficult. But I think he was, finding the criticism again a little bit over the top. He didn't like some of the articles and stories that were cropping up. But I would say for 3.5 of his 4 years at Argyle, I'd like to think we got on really well. He understood I had a job to do, and I understood where he was coming from. He was a very successful manager for the football club. His first season, he took us to Wembley in the playoff final. The playoff final against Wimbledon was a complete disaster, but he got us to Wembley, and obviously that doesn't happen very often with Argyle. Second season, they were promoted. Should have won the league really that season, but drew at Grimsby on the last day, and Portsmouth picked Argyle to the title. The season after that in League One, they almost got into the playoffs, and to go from where they were to almost making the playoffs that season. It was only at Scunthorpe on a Tuesday, I think the penultimate game of the season, where the playoffs went within Argyle's grasp. And even the fourth season he was in charge, they were competitive, they were good, but just for, I'm never quite sure why it all unravelled as quickly as it did, but it felt like about in February or March of that season, they were sort of mid-table-ish and didn't look like anything was going to happen. And then it just completely unravelled. We touched on Accrington 5-1 earlier in the chat, and he lost his job before the final game of the season against Scunthorpe, which Nance took charge of, and Argyle won, but didn't do enough to stay up. But again, when you look back in time, in the immediate aftermath of these things, it's difficult to sort of make a proper judgment of people. But if you look at Derek Adams' CV at Plymouth Argyle and where they were when he arrived and the success they had under him, I think he has to be classed as a very successful manager. It did end poorly, but he was very confident in himself. He did. I mean, him and Steve Evans used to wind each other up a lot. I think there was a game at Mansfield where Argyle played Mansfield, and Steve Evans came out, did the press conference, and said that Derek Adams had said he was the best manager outside the Premier League, and that really wound him up. And obviously, Derek and Paul Cook, who was the manager of Portsmouth, had some real humdingers on the touchline, and I know the Portsmouth fans say there is no derby and no rivalry between Portsmouth and Argyle, but there was a rivalry between Argyle and Portsmouth when Derek Adams and Paul Cook were the managers, and it was all good fun. It was all pantomime, made for good copy. But in lots of ways, you're better off having a manager that is passionate and wears his heart on the sleeve than maybe some that aren't quite as outgoing. So I enjoyed working with Derek. And completely off topic, as we're recording this today, I've seen that Morecambe have been expelled from the National League, and Derek is the manager there. And having seen Argyle play Morecambe, it doesn't seem like that long ago up there. Very sad to see Morecambe in the difficulties they're at and the challenging times that he and the people up there are having to deal with.
Yeah, obviously this, he's probably looking at going out in the international break. This pod, so goodness knows, sadly, what could it's good to flag up where it is, but yeah, goodness knows, sadly, what position they could be in by that time. Hopefully, they'll have found a buyer and they'll be competing in the National League. I'm not terribly optimistic that will be the case.
But me neither.
In terms of he had a run-in with another one was Graham Westley, and he actually had a run-in with you, didn't he? Well, at a press conference. Can you tell us about that?
With my hat, Sam.
Yes, bobble hat. He didn't like.
He didn't like my hat, which was, I wouldn't say I'm the most extravagantly dressed of people, but I did have a sort of woolly hat because obviously I haven't got much insulation up top to keep me warm. So we were in the then press room at Argyle, which was a bit of a cold, damp, drafty place, and it was he came in and did his press conference. I think he was the manager of Stevenage at the time. I can't remember which club. I think it was Stevenage, but yeah, I asked him a question and he just had to go at my hat, and I can't remember the exact quote, to be honest, but I was a bit taken aback, and I think even the BBC did a little piece on it that he a local journalist about his headwear. So that was an unusual one, definitely, out of press conferences.
Yeah, it's understandable to think it was Stevenage because it was almost always Stevenage with Graham Westley, but that was actually in his brief spell managing Newport, and the
was it? Okay.
The draw was then the replay, and the replay got us to Anfield to play Liverpool.
That's right. Yes.
Argyle had the last laugh in that one.
They did, and I continued to wear my hat afterwards as well, although it no longer survives. So, but yeah, I always wear hats, but it's the only time anyone's ever had a go at me in my hat. I've always tried to be fairly smartly dressed. That was one thing I copied from, or not copied, but Graham Hamley at the Herald would always go to games in a suit and tie and shirt and everything like that. And he said because he wanted people to think that he was working and he was professional and he was doing a job. He wasn't just there for a jolly. And I thought, yeah, that makes good sense. So I must admit, after the COVID years, or the COVID season in particular, when I was fortunate enough to be able to go to games and fans weren't, but I obviously didn't go in a suit and tie then. But I've generally tried to be reasonably smartly dressed over the years.
That kind of final one for me on that region. So you've kind of spoken already about how in the kind of a previous answer about how Ryan Lowe came in and was very dynamic, really lifted the club up. That COVID season must have been really strange with all the protocols you had to follow and reporting from games in an empty ground. I guess it must have been real mixed feelings. Probably on one hand, you were probably thinking, well, I'm one of the only ones getting to see this game. I'm quite lucky. But on the other hand, it must have been just a very bizarre experience to report on.
Yeah, it was horrible. I mean, from a purely personal point of view, it was good for me because it got me out of the house. And I was well aware, trust me, that there were so many people that were stuck in houses, flats, what have you, and I could go and see games. It was weird, though. The one game that sticks in my mind that season, Sam, was we played Charlton away on Boxing Day. And so I drove up on Boxing Day morning. I would have left fairly early. I mean, there was nothing on the roads, just nothing. At the time, there was I carried a letter from the editor, so that because on the motorway matrix boards. It was all stay at home, save lives, that sort of message that was out there. And they gave me a letter to say, look, if anyone stops you and says, what are you doing out on the roads? This is to say that you're a reporter and you're, authorised to go to games. So I was literally going with this letter to every away game, in case anyone stopped me, which they never did. But I drove up to Charlton that day, and you're driving into London and there was no one around. It was ridiculous. I got to the Valley, never been able to park at the Valley, but because there was no one there, I got into the car park. But I remember I got to like the entrance hut, and you had to do the test with the swab and down your throat. It was just so surreal. And then, sat up in the press box. There was no one there. After the game, the pitch was sort of completely out of bounds to anybody apart from the players and the staff. So I had to sort of go around the back of the stand at the Valley towards the end where the away fans sit. And then I had to sort of wait by this gate, and then somebody came and let me in, and then I could go and interview Ryan Lowe after the game. But I had to stand on one side of the advert hoardings, and he had to be on the other side, and he had to sort of stretch out the dictaphone to record. And it was just I was glad I was able to go. It was good for me, but it was horrible, and I just, such a weird season. And it's 5 years ago. It just hard to believe that we went through that. And so that Charlton game really sticks in my mind. I remember being at Hull. Hull was a big, massive stadium, massive press box, and you sat in a stadium of that size, and there was no one there. It was just, it was like covering in the old days when Argyle were in the football combination in the late 90s, and you'd go along to Home Park and there might be 50, 100 people watching a football combination reserve game. But you were watching, League One football, and not very nice. I don't know what it would have been like for the players, because, there was no atmosphere, how they motivated themselves. There was one game at Home Park against Lincoln City where it ended up 4-3 to Argyle. Joe Edwards scored 2 in the last couple of minutes. It was an amazing finish, and it was quite good. But I always think, and Joe's definitely mentioned this a couple of times, I think, in interviews, that if that game had been played in front of a full house at Home Park, it would have gone down as one of the all-time great Home Park games, because it was just literally seesaw. It was something like Argyle 1-0 up, 2-1 down, 3-2 down, and then Joe scored 2 goals late on to win 4-3. And so one of the best games I've ever seen at Home Park was literally watched by no one. So very strange times. Thankfully, long in the background now.
Yeah, let's hope we never have to go through that. And that's segued us nicely into the more recent times. And, we think we've had a roller coaster between the years 2000 to 2018-19, where the last sort of 4 years has pretty much had everything bar a financial crisis. Touch wood, that doesn't happen. We went from, we've obviously touched on this on the emergency podcast you've been on, but particularly obviously the last 2 years with all the head coach changes, and the one continuity of it all has been Simon Hallett trying to keep everything together and trying to instill positivity. And obviously now we're into another head coach. In a weird way, and I don't want this to sound like you're sticking the knife in or anything to the club, but in a weird way, just how much fun has the last couple of years been covering Argyle? Because I don't imagine, every time you take a holiday, Chris, something drastic seems to happen. So
I know.
I don't know about your planning, but how much, you haven't been short of work, have you?
I'm going to have to change my holiday planning for next year, aren't I? Because, 2024, I was driving into we were on a family holiday, and we were driving into Ypres in Belgium, just over the French border. And I was driving, and suddenly the phone started pinging away. And I was driving, so I carried on driving, checked into the hotel and looked at the phone. Wayne Rooney's going to be the next Argyle manager. And you think, what? And then this year, again, family holiday, sat having a lovely family meal by the seaside, nice seafood paella, and phone starts pinging and Mirren's leaving. So yes, I really don't want a hat trick next year, so I'm going to have to rethink my holiday strategy for 2026.
Yeah, we need to ward off any clubs you might go after Tom Cleverley after we get promoted.
Absolutely, Sam.
Off,
I mean, you say about the managers, Joe. I mean, it was one thing that Argyle. So when John Sheridan took over in January 2013, to Derek leaving April 2019, they were the only two managers. So over 6 years, we had two managers. And now Tom Cleverley is the fifth different head coach in basically 18 months, isn't he?
Even Lowe was 2.5 years. So actually from January 13 to December 21, very nearly 9 years, only 3 managers. And we've had, Schumacher, Foster, Rooney, Muslich, obviously come since then. And now Cleverley, which is absolutely crazy to think about.
So, Joe, you said it must be fun. Professionally rewarding when there's stuff going on, because as a journalist, you want to bring news to people. You want to try and inform people as much as you can with as much insight that you can provide. So, it is, I wouldn't say fun. I would say rewarding from a journalist point of view, that you're covering something that matters and means a lot to people and the community that I live and work in. I've covered this football club a long time. Palace are my team, but I like to see Argyle do well. I like to, I'm in the fortunate position where my job is to go and watch Argyle away games. And I know the Green Army have to pay out of their own pocket to do it. And they have my full respect, the numbers everyone turns out in. Traveling to the away games, it does take up quite a bit of time, and it's quite often 6:30 before I'm leaving the Stadium of Light, and then I've got a 400-mile journey home. Now, I'm not criticising, I'm not complaining, I'm a very lucky guy, but I don't do all of that to see Argyle struggling and never winning an away game for 11 months and things like that. So it's always more fun to see Argyle doing well. But when they are struggling, there is a job to be done. It's an important job when things aren't going well, to try and get answers for fans, to try and hold people to account, to try and get people to explain why things and decisions have been done. Now, you can sometimes ask the questions and you might not get the answers that everybody wants or a lot of people want, but it's important to have people, media, and this isn't just in football. This is in every walk of life. I think to have people that can hold councils, governments, football clubs, you name it, to account. And so I try and take that responsibility seriously. That you don't take any pleasure or satisfaction when Argyle are struggling, but there's still an awful lot of interest and people want to know what's going on, and that's why you've got to be there and trying to shine a light on what's gone right, what's gone wrong.
This is where your media training comes in better than mine. Perhaps rewarding was a more suitable word than fun that I should have used. I'm mindful of how long we've had you, so we've only got a couple of questions left on the list. We obviously don't want to take up too much more of your time. You talk about being a voice for the fan base, and I hope I speak for everybody, and just how much we appreciate how much work you've put in the last couple of years in asking those tough questions. And I imagine with the relationship you have with the club, they are tough questions to ask. But in terms of how things have changed in society and in the media and things now with the prevalence of social media, just how has the job changed in getting these big stories, these big scoops, if you like, out to the public? Is it easier? Is it harder? Do you feel under more pressure to beat the next guy, to get the news story out first? How does it work for you nowadays compared to obviously 20 years ago?
That's a good question. There's some good points around that, Joe. I'd rather try and get the story factually correct and put as much insight into it as I can than necessarily get it first. So in the day and age that we live in now with social media, lots of the transfer stories are broken by football journalists who have good contacts, agents, people at football clubs. So a lot of the time you are reacting, fact checking, making sure, because not every, as we all know, not every transfer speculation story we see is based in reality. Often there's other reasons for people wanting people to think certain things. So I try to make sure that any story I do is factually correct, and I'm not sort of just taking a punt at things. How's the job changed? I mean, oh crikey, we could do a podcast on this. I mean, I used to go to games in 1997 with a notepad and a pen, and that was it. And now I go to games with all sorts of devices and bits and pieces. You're doing live blogs, you're doing Facebook Lives. So I'm still doing the same job in that I'm reporting on Plymouth Argyle, but the way I do it is completely different because of the world and the social media landscape that we live in. And it is a very different world in terms of access to players and managers. You know, when Paul Sturrock was in charge at Argyle, you could pretty much rock up at home park at lunchtime, know the team will have finished training, might have had a bite to eat for lunch, and when they were heading to the car park, you could say, Mick Heathcote, can I have a quick word with you about this, that, and the other? You'd have a chat, you know, you'd see the manager on a similar sort of basis to what we do now, but it would just be the manager. There wouldn't be any other staff from the club sort of involved in either interviewing him or, you know, being in the room sort of thing. So it was a very different time, whereas now everything is more structured. Argyle have got their own staff who do the Argyle TV and all the bits and pieces that the fans will see. And we even now have got to the stage where you quite often see the press conferences that we do are filmed by the club to be shown on Argyle TV. So I think I'm aware that people see those interviews. I would like to think that the questions I've asked over the last 2 or 3 years are the ones that I've probably always asked in one way or the other. But of course, they weren't shown on TV or streamed at the time. And so people would only ever see the quotes of the manager and not necessarily the questions that were asked. So, yeah, it's a very different world. I mean, the players always 99% of the time have been fantastic. I've had very few players that haven't been really good interviews. We saw Owen Oseni on Saturday after the Bristol City game. Lovely guy, came in, never met him before, had a great chat with him. And that's one of the things I do enjoy about the job I've had, is that I've got to know so many players, managers, coaches, fans, staff at the club. And it's just building up those relationships, friendships in some cases. The sort of analogy I always give is that I've never really had to watch a soap opera like EastEnders or Coronation Street, because Plymouth Argyle is my real life soap opera. You have highs and lows, good days, bad days. You meet fascinating people. You meet people of all different backgrounds and types and characters and personalities. And so reporting on a football club, in my opinion, is just like reporting on a soap opera, watching your own soap opera. And so it's changed so much. Fundamentally, I'm still there on a Saturday reporting on a game of football, but in a very different world. But I still enjoy it. That's the thing. I'm very fortunate that I still enjoy it. I enjoy it more on Argyle winning. It was getting a little bit of a slog with all the away games and not winning and wondering, are we ever going to win away from home? So that win at Portsmouth in March was that made the journey home on the Tuesday night from Portsmouth much more palatable.
Yeah, just one final chronological question, Chris. We've got a wide-ranging one just after, but what you said actually inadvertently gave me the perfect segue to what I was going to ask anyway, which is when you talk about kind of soap operas and then sort of like maybe dramatic moments and cliffhangers, if you like. The one that comes to mind in recent times is the famous Miran Muslic press conference. Like, imagine the media staff at the club must have been watching that through their hands when he was sort of going through that, tearing into how the club weren't supporting him and they weren't tying players down, even though it later emerged we actually did have an interim staff in those roles. But that's Miran for you. But how was it being in the room when that was going on? You must think, well, hang on a minute, this is again, similar to what I said about the Fletcher thing. This is
that's exactly what I was going to say, Sam. It's one of those where you sat there and it's being recorded, and he said what he said about recruitment and director of football and all those sort of things, and you think, right, okay, your ears do prick up. And this is where it goes back to the professionally rewarding bit, that you know that what he's just said there is going to get a lot of attention. And that was an interesting sort of week, because after the Preston game up at Deepdale, I did ask him at the end of the press conference, how did he feel about next season and committing himself to next season, and he didn't want to go down there, and was quite to the point that he didn't want to discuss it, which is fine. That's his up to him how he answers questions. It's up to any manager how they answer questions. But it did feel like then, when we saw him before the Leeds game and then after the Leeds game, that maybe, but when you look back at hindsight, you can see how it was going to turn out, can't you? And perhaps at the time you don't fully appreciate exactly what's been said and what it's potentially leading to. But when I look back on that week, say from after the Preston game to after the Leeds game, it was clear that Miran was not happy to stay at Argyle in League One, and that was the way it went. But yeah, press conferences like those, the pre-Leeds one, are interesting, and like I say, because everything's filmed now, it's there. It's there for everyone to see. I suppose the important thing from my point of view is you try and get a story out as quick as you can about it, so that people can read your, how you saw it, and take it from there.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, Simon Hallett said on Pilgrim's Pod very recently that after that kind of press conference rant, if you like, Miran rung him and said he was committed to staying there the next season. Whether that actually was the case, and then something changed dramatically back the other way, who knows? Or maybe he was just telling Simon what he wants to hear. But as you said, all the signs were very much there. I think we've covered probably about half of the managers over your overall tenure. We've not been able to go into too much detail on maybe a few, like the Wayne Rooney thing and the Stephen Schumacher years. Yeah. I don't know, as anybody who watches the podcast, but no, I never normally pass up the opportunity to talk about Schumacher, but I think today we've been generous enough of your time.
Ian Holloway would be a good one to talk about. So
Holloway, I didn't even think. Yeah, he was.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at the Argyle managers, Warnock, Pulis, Holloway, Sturrock is a massive name in Scotland. Rooney. Yeah, I mean,
even cleverly, Man United, yes. England, Everton. Yeah, even him now, another one to that list.
And just for a quick line, is very early days with dealing with him, but very nice guy, calm, measured, thoughtful in his responses, hasn't shirked answering any questions. I've enjoyed getting to know him, and hopefully it works out well for him.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. And kind of final question for now before we excuse me, I do apologise. That what's something right in my throat that Aaron might have to edit out. I do apologise. Anyway, let's start over again. Anyway, Chris, final question for me before we let you go. You've been very generous with your time. It's probably going to be a two-parter. And yeah, maybe perhaps another time we can discuss those managers you've got a little glossed over in this one.
Delighted to. Yeah.
Thank you. Final question for now. What tips, if any, would you give to any young and or aspiring journalists on how to make their way in the trade in an ever-changing age? What do you say?
Don't come through just yet, I'd imagine. He still wants a few more years doing it.
It's funny you should ask that question, Sam, but I was sat next to a young man who was on work experience with Argyle at the Truro City pre-season game, and he was wanting to go into journalism and asked me a very similar question to what you've just asked. And the world of media has changed massively in the time that I've been doing it. And why wouldn't it? Because, it's nearly 3 decades, which is a scary thing for me to say, but it has changed massively. What I would say to any sort of person who's thinking about going into the media is that there are people out there that will tell you that media is dying and it's not a career for the future. And do you really want to do it? Yes, the days of newspapers are in decline, and eventually there will come a stage where there will be no newspapers. And I find that very sad, but that's just the way of the world. There's still a very important place in society for media. I touched on it a little bit earlier. It's holding people to account, being the as neutral as you can be voice on lots of topics. And again, I'm not just talking about football, but in everyday life as well. There's an important job that there are independent voices who are trained, qualified, that can ask the right questions to the right people to find out stories, situations, positions of people. And so I would thoroughly urge anyone that wants to go into the media to go for it. It's an important job to do. There are different ways of doing it. Clearly we're in the world now of social media and podcasts and things like that. And where the media goes in the future, goodness only knows. But I think there will always be a place for people that want to report on things and give an objective view on stories, situations. So I said I'm trying to remember the young man's name, so I do apologize. I think it was Toby, but I could be wrong. But he was very keen, and I hope that he enjoyed his work experience at Argyle, and if he wants to do journalism, go for it, because it's an important job to do. And go for it. And it's impossible to say how things will turn out in the future, but I count myself very fortunate to sort of had my career as a journalist covering a football club. It has been rewarding, enjoyable, stressful at times, frustrating, the highs and the lows, but I've really enjoyed it. And like I say, I would thoroughly urge anyone that's thinking of doing it, go for it. There might not be newspapers in 5-10 years time, but there will definitely be platforms for people to do important work. So to go for it.
Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure and honour to have you on for your very own My Argyle Life. I suspect that you might become the first person to have a running series within a running series. Because
it's one of the.
Go on.
It's one of the benefits of being around so long, Joe, is that I might not have anything particularly interesting to say, but I've got lots to say. So
I think I've certainly found it incredibly insightful, and I'm sure everybody who's watched on will as well. And I think Sam's found us a perfect content idea for the month of October, where we have a little round table discussing just some of the personalities that we've had manage Argyle. Chris, on behalf of the whole fan base, thank you for the work you continue to do so well for the club in, as you say, holding people to account and bringing us all the excellent news you do. Thank you for your time, and I'm sure we'll bump into you around Home Park on a match day for many years to come.
Let's hope so, Joe. And Sam, thank you very much for the invite to join you in the podcast. You've been doing some really great work. I do think, podcasts are a really valuable way for fans to interact with each other. So keep up the good work. And thanks very much for the invite, and look forward to the next time we have a chat.
Cheers, Chris. Thank you.